Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Greetings.
Thanks for being here, everyone. We'll just give another few minutes for the rest of the members to join us. We'll give it 2 minutes. Hey, everyone. Looks like a few people are still joining us, so we'll give it one more minute and then we'll get started. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the 5th meeting of the Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee here for ONA. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and I hope you're enjoying your summers thus far. I just wanted to note and welcome Jay Blake is here today in place of Alyssa Gertler in Clatsop County, and Karen Burig is here in place of Martha Fritzy today in Clackamas County. So thanks to both of you for joining us. Let's go ahead and review our agenda. Next slide, please. There we go. You may all recall that we've been working our way through a 3-meeting arc, which may even extend a bit further into July. But in April, we talked about accounting for constraints. And in May, we covered estimating capacity. Our focus today, and like I said, into July, is to talk about development ready land and what it means for an area to be readily served with public facilities. But before we get to that topic today, first Maddie is going to review our racial equity framework focus areas and then kind of frame the development ready conversation for our group discussion. And then at the end of our meeting, we'll wrap up with next steps. So with that, I'll hand it over to Maddie.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining this afternoon. I'm Madeline Phillips. I'm the Public Facilities Planner at the Housing Division here at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. This is our long-awaited jump off point into the world of interfacing public facilities with housing. You've been with us for the last few meetings to talk a little bit about how a city goes through the process of buildable land inventory work, and other topics that are related to how a city sets up for understanding housing capacity and need. We're going to continue that conversation today, talking a little bit about inventorying what does the term development ready land mean, and how do we inventory land that is considered development ready. And we're going to move into and unpack some more conversations over the next couple meetings that we wanted to preview here. First of all, unpacking serviceability, thinking about the role facilities play in housing production strategies, and defining a little bit more clearly the ability to serve property. And then thinking specifically about points at which a city participates in facilitating the readiness of land for development. And maybe the stickiest part, getting into areas where utility constraints prevent housing from being produced on land that is available within existing inventory. Into July, we'll talk a little bit more about where that interfaces with needed housing. And our colleagues from the Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee will join us in discussing a little bit more deeply where our two subject areas meet. And our hope is that either after our second meeting in July or thereabouts, we will be preparing a survey that we'd love your support in sharing with other professionals, particularly those that have interest or their work is related to some of the work we're doing, as an opportunity to interface with not only the topics that we talked about already, but thinking about how we present and set up for the next series of discussions that we'll have together as an advisory committee. And then finally, moving into August, we're talking about how this all comes together. Our hope was that the topics that we've presented thus far will, as taken together, will help inform some of our work specific to housing capacity analyses. You can go to the next slide, please. So we'll take a moment here and think about the racial inequity framework focus areas. We'll draw on a topic that we've touched on over several meetings already, which is to acknowledge ways that the land use system has disproportionately affected some groups, particularly from our conversations up till now, thinking about reducing these historical inequities specifically related to public investments. There are groups that we know have not shared in the same opportunities than others. Some of that is contextual to the time in which those land use practices were either created or promulgated. Some of them continue or persist today. And there are a number of ways that in working through these questions, we might put on our equity lens glasses and understand how folks have been either supported or disenfranchised by the way that we've implemented some of our planning practice. From last meeting, we talked a bit about partially vacant land and the identification of that land, putting certain folks in a state of vulnerability that may thank you for changing the slide, kind. Thinking about ways that folks who are marginalized may already be disproportionately burdened by that designation. We'll also expound on that and relate it directly to the way that a city decides to make investments in their public facilities may add to that precarious position of vulnerability, particularly thinking about unintended consequences. There are areas of communities that have not seen significant infrastructure investment in many Oregon cities. Those areas sometimes are affectionately referred to as naturally occurring affordable housing. Some of those areas, if they see or when they see investment, may have both a risk at the front end of displacing folks because land ownership changes are precipitate after or precipitate I'm sorry, that certain land ownerships change ahead of a public investment or immediate to a public investment. And then there are issues that we might talk about mitigating of what happens after a public investment is made and a significant amount of capacity is added, let's say, to an area, and folks are displaced as a result of that investment. So we just wanted to put that at the forefront of everyone's mind before we get into this conversation about defining development readiness. If you could move to the next slide. Thank you. The question here is, where in the housing planning process do we find development ready land? And in fact, we find development ready land in ORS 197A.210. And this is the point following buildable land inventories in the land use plan in the goal 10 process, that a city shall inventory its development ready land. Development ready land may be a city may demonstrate that preparing land for housing capacity, that they are preparing land for housing capacity, and that ORS 197A.100 is the reference to the housing production strategy process. So you'll see that a city shall inventory its development ready land, and then second step, if the city is not able to reach its housing production, if the total housing production target is greater than the capacity of development ready land, then strategies might be put in place to prepare land for development or redevelopment or increase the capacity of existing development ready land. So that speaks to a series of different steps that a city might take. And what we would like to unpack here is the definition of development ready land. You can move to the next slide. Development ready land is also defined in the definition section. So pardon the lack of lineal alignment of these slides with the way that the statute is assembled. But development ready land means buildable land that will support production of housing during a period under the target of ORS 184.455. So essentially, when a city receives its target allocation through the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, there is also a specified timeline upon which that city is meant to aspirationally achieve their target production. And we're hoping that development ready lands aligns with that in the sense that there are enough buildable land to support production of needed housing as defined under that target. And I'll walk through the three qualifiers that define development ready land. So specifically, currently annexed and zoned land to allow housing through clear and objective standards and procedures. There's a part B that we're going to come back to, but B is readily served through adjacent public facilities or identified in the near-term provision of public facilities through an adopted CIP, and not encumbered by local, state, or federal protective regulations. So in other words, land that's available for annexation and has a zoning designation that allows for housing. So it's residentially zoned, and an owner or developer is able to move forward in bringing that property into a city, into an incorporated city limits through clear and objective standards. We'd like to take some time to at least acknowledge and understand and make sure there's a check for understanding on parts A and C here before we move into B. We feel that the team sat and thought pretty deeply about how to consider this issue. And part B seems to be the meat that we'll have to get into related to public facilities. So before we get into that, we'd like to talk a little bit about this part A, make sure that that's clear, and then also part C, not encumbered. And you'll remember in our previous conversation that we in the context of buildable land inventories, we talked a bit about constraints, and we believe C speaks to that conversation pretty directly, that land is not encumbered by an applicable protective regulation, either at the local, state, or federal level, and is available for development or to prepare the land for development. Let me pause there and ask if there are any questions among our advisory committee members before we move forward, and I hand this back to Steve. Go ahead, Damien.
I'll go ahead.
Oh, Mary Kyle, go ahead.
I just wanted to be clear that reference in ORS 184-455 sub 1 is to a clear time frame. It's either 6 years or 8 years, 6 years for Metro, 8 years for others. So it's a time period less than the full UGB and is really tied to the housing production strategies that cities over 10,000 have to produce. So I think that's been kind of missing from the materials and this. So I just want to be clear, that's what we're talking about. It's not whether or not the rest of the lands in the UGB are or could be developable. It's really that 6 to 8 year time frame that's being looked at for the housing productions, tied to the housing production strategies also.
Thank you, Mary Kyle. And in fact, there's an additional reference to the production strategy timeline, as you mentioned, in the determination of development ready land in 197A.100. That reference earlier, in fact, after the point of BLI is to determine that actions to demonstrate cities are demonstrating that they are preparing land for housing capacity through their strategies.
Right. So other lands in UGB may be perfectly serviceable. It's just whether those are beyond the time frame. They may be provided. The city may have a plan for providing services to those in year 15 or whatever. But thanks.
Karen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for letting me join. Martha and I have been kind of backing up each other on the various committees. And so one of the things I just wanted to, so for Clackamas County, so we represent Clackamas County, and we are in some ways new to this information, doing this type of work now that we're looking at the urban unincorporated areas specifically. But it does call out the fact that the term city is used a lot. And so these directions will also be applying to lands that are in the county too. So that should be thought about as we're talking about this. So that's one thing I wanted to just highlight, and that kind of goes through my mind. I think another thing, and as we look at this particular set of items, I wasn't clear if something had to meet all three, right? A, B, and C, or if it was if the lands are one of these three things. I wasn't quite sure about that, the way it was written up. So maybe we can kind of talk about that. And then I was also interested in what the term annexed means in this context. Does that mean annexed into a city? Does it mean annexed into a service district? I'd like some more information about that. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, Karen. And let's get Damien's question and then maybe kind of see if we can start responding. And because Karen's second question. Anyway, I think leads into the discussion we wanted to have. So Damien, go ahead.
Thanks, Steve. Two questions that may seem obvious, but I wanted to make sure I'm tracking. So as we're talking about development ready lands, we're talking about those that are maybe a subset of what buildable lands you've already identified in our buildable land inventory. And these are going to include lands that are not already, for example, protected by, say, Goal 5 protection measures that may require some kind of discretionary review, which takes me back to 4A, which means development ready means they're annexed in zone, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But these are lands for which somebody could come into a city or a county and apply for building permits without going through some kind of discretionary land use permit.
Great, thanks, Damien. So I think we have Madeline. I'm not sure, who wants to respond, but Karen's first question or first note was just about the distinction between cities, and that it also applies to unincorporated areas inside counties. Do we want to touch on that at all? Or is that
Certainly,
we need
certainly
to be
we
clear with our
can.
language? Yeah.
We can certainly, Karen, I appreciate you raising this because this is a nuance that in recent session has somewhat changed the way we're talking about this topic in particular. There are likely to be, well, first of all, to sort of fold in, and we'll obviously come back to the question around Part A in our discussion, but the term annexed clearly would not apply to an unincorporated place. However, it may certainly apply to a service district, and perhaps that from an intent standpoint is what is intended, that a service district covers or provides facilities for an area allowing development to occur. Beth, go ahead.
Maddie, I think what Karen's referring to is the parts of Clackamas County that are within the Metro UGB, but aren't in a city. There's quite a lot of land like that. And otherwise, as far as I know, it's often treated the same way as though it's in a city, but Clackamas County is the people managing it.
And has service district coverage, meaning a water district, a sewer district covers those areas.
Yeah, I'm a little less sure about how all of those things work. Yeah.
Karen, do you want to say something about that?
I guess I was going to say, yes, that is the case. And really, I think just the language needs to be cleaned up, right? Around currently annexed. And I think it more easily, I think would have been applicable annexed to a city, right? When cities were the only ones doing this.
Yes.
But now it opens it up to more things. And so it becomes less clear and needs that clarification as we move forward, I think is a way that I would put it.
As a follow-up to that, Karen, just quickly, if we took the statute, which we're not necessarily in a position to be able to change the statute, but we may be able to clarify in rule how this is interpreted. In your experience in Clackamas County, do zoning designations provide some clarity as to which land is available to allow housing development in the context of being able to provide utilities and prepare land for development?
I think that there is some subtlety there. It isn't always cut and dry, and it may have an urban zone, but it still might not have the services that are needed in certain areas. And often those things are taken care of when it is then annexed into a city. So I think there's a lot we still have to figure out.
It sounds as if there's there are some very unique cases, particularly in places, metro in this applicability, but also in other places that were specified in legislation around the requirement that counties take on the responsibility of planning for doing buildable land inventories for communities in their county, for example. So Tillamook County comes to mind in terms of places that may have the same challenge and applicability of your question.
I think there's people who want to continue on with this part of the
Please.
conversation. Before we do, I just want to loop back with one thing that Karen said and what Damien said. So Karen was saying, I mean, Madeline, can you confirm for everyone that in this definition, it's all three, A, B, and C, that apply and not one of the above? That's the intention?
That's my understanding, yes.
Yeah, mine as well. And then to Damien's point, essentially, the development ready lands are a subset of what's identified in the BLI, and that the assumption is that they're ready for someone to come in and submit development application.
That is also correct. I wanted to point out one response to your comment, Damien, around clear and objective standards and the relationship to constraints and or encumbrances. I think you were alluding to an example might be a property that contains or is partially encumbered by a wetland or something similar, where there are or would be clear and objective standards, could be clear and objective standards applicable to that. However, there are likely some challenges related to developing that parcel at its fullest potential, or as it's zoned on a map. And so this might be a consideration or an area where rule and or guidance materials may need to speak more directly to some of those identified constraints, if I'm understanding your comment.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's go to Al.
Thanks, Steve. I want to talk first a little bit about the currently annexed and zoned to allow housing through clear and objective standards and procedures. As I read that, and this is appropriate for, I think, interpretive rulemaking, and the interpretive rule should probably explain what is meant by annexed to allow housing through clear and objective standard procedures, and also zoned to allow. Both of those terms are followed by that description. A property that is annexed in to allow housing through clear and objective standards and procedures, I would suggest interpretive rule could say that is a property that has all of the annexation that it needs to allow housing through clear and objective procedures. And and with zoning, it's the same thing. There's actually there are some cases out there that I've been involved in, and some others that basically say that, on the other hand, you can have something where you've zoned it so that it seems to allow housing through clear and objective standards and procedures, but in fact, those standards and procedures are so stringent that you can't actually do that. I had that case in Creswell where they had clear and objective procedures that made it very clear that you couldn't put a manufactured home park anywhere in Creswell. So I think those are both capable of clarification through interpretive rulemaking without having to change the statute or the goal. And so that's how I'd approach that. I've got a minute. I'd like to say a word about item C, what the encumbered issue. That could also use some clarification. Right now, I think there's a lack of clarity about what it means to be encumbered. And I think we're saying here that it is partially encumbered. You can have a piece of property that is 96% not encumbered and 4% encumbered. You can have a piece of property that is completely shown as wetlands on a LiDAR or on a local inventory, but has not gone through the DSL interpretation process. We should clarify both those situations so that it is clear that those properties, what parts of those properties are encumbered and what it means to be encumbered by a regulation. For example, the Division of State Lands right now, no matter how good your planning and zoning and everything else are, if the LiDAR shows up, you've got hydric soils, VSL requires local jurisdictions to go through a 1 to 2 year process of identifying the property, basically proving what is not encumbered. And so you have this non-clear, non-objective responsibility to prove that land that you have done everything else for is not in fact encumbered. So the presumption is that until that is done, it would certainly not qualify. So those are some things that I think can be done through rulemaking and should be done.
Thank you, Al. Let's go to Casera.
Hi, wanted to touch on and just note that for unincorporated county areas that are inside the UGB, I think we'll have both cases where in certain instances, development is going to go through the county, but annexation is going to be required to a city in urban reserves. So just wanted to, at least for us for Clean Water Services, point out that we're going to be dealing with probably both those instances. And then for annexation into a special district, we've seen it go kind of both ways, either concurrently with annexation into a city or as a separate action. And then on C, I really agree with what Al just pointed out. If we, depending on how this is interpreted, I can't think of many properties that aren't in some way encumbered. If we are, looking at Clean Water Act and stormwater regulations or easements, dedications for, roadways and utilities. So I think there's definitely an opportunity there through rule to provide some clarity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, you and Al. That's helping clarify things. Mary Kyle?
Thanks. On that Part C aspect, I think rules to clarify are important, and that to distinguish in those, or think about distinguishing those, that there are 3 different categories of Goal 5 restrictions. One is protect the resource entirely, no development. One is allow development fully, don't protect the resource at all. And the other is limit conflicting uses. And so the latter 2 allow development. And if you limit conflicting uses, at least the Goal 5 rule requires that the development standards be clear and objective. So a city may have done all of that, and it's not just wetlands. There are other issues in Goal 5, so I don't think we should get too high centered just on wetlands, although I know it's a big issue. But if a city has really done all that, and that land, even with a Goal 5 conflicting uses overlay, may be development ready at a certain level of development. So I think the rules need to clarify those. Just Goal 5 alone doesn't mean it's not development ready. So
Great, thank you. Brock, go ahead.
The other thing that I would note on A is that under ORS 197480 sub 5, not all local jurisdictions are required to have clear and objective standards and procedures adopted for mobile homes and manufactured home parks as well. I'm not sure how many do versus don't, but when I was looking through statute, that's one thing that I noticed. And so for a lot of housing types, that clear and objective standard might be there. Specifically for those 2, there might be cities that don't have clear and objective standards for those in place already.
And what was the ruler statute that you cited, Brock?
197480 sub 5. I think it's A, but there's no precursor to it. It's just 5A.
Okay. Great. Well, it seems there's some consensus of opinion that rulemaking is needed to provide some clarity around some of these definitions. Are there any other initial thoughts or comments on A and C before we move on to talking about areas that are readily served with public facilities? All right, let's go to the next slide. So we wanted to just start and make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what facilities are being considered. And, we internally talked back and forth, but water, wastewater, stormwater, transportation are the kind of core ones that we have been talking about. Do folks agree that these are the four that we should be focused on, or are there other infrastructure types that should be considered, or other factors that we should be thinking about? And I'm always trying to also think about, when we're having these conversations, what it means for jurisdictions of different sizes, available data, etc. But these are the four that we started with. Sarah?
Something that we've run into, we're expanding our reuse program. So I don't know if it's worth adding. I know it's not available everywhere, but just wanted to note that some of the jurisdictions we work with, we've gone through and they've helped us add that to the code to make sure that non-potable or reuse is something that can be considered.
All right. Thank you for that. And Heather?
Yeah, I'm curious if there's been any discussion amongst state staff about electrical. I know that's at least typically something that we haven't run into over the years a lot of issues with, but more recently with some of the demands related and projected demands for electric vehicles and other movements towards electrification in general. That's something that, at least in discussion with our eWeb, they've raised some concerns about electrical loads for particularly kind of the more suburban areas of the city. So just curious if there's been any conversation about that.
Yeah. Oh, you're ready, Madeline. Go for it.
Heather, thanks for bringing that up. Especially, I appreciate that, because that's one of the comments that at least I have received, and other colleagues of mine that worked within the housing division have received, around challenges that individual developments experience when trying to pursue development of parcels for housing that they perceive to be needed. A lot of times that power supply is a huge barrier. Also, in looking at some of the definitions referenced in the attached memo to this week's packet, you'll see that utility services are defined in statute in the context of utility providers, and public facilities are somewhat distinct in that. It's a great question to all of us to think about how to involve the Public Utilities Commission, PUC, in this conversation, and the role that utility providers play in facilitating, enabling, and/or constraining the opportunity to produce housing. And I venture a guess that the regulatory environment for utilities is substantially more complex than that of facilities being typically at most state managed or locally managed, versus those utility providers and/or utility regulations that tend to be meeting federal regulation. So we may just need to navigate that at a different level of conversation than perhaps the navigating at the level of jurisdictions and/or state partners. So thank you for raising it, and it's certainly a concern. Internally, I'm not sure our team has had we have not had a robust enough conversation to be able to speak to how to go about doing that, but those are just some thoughts initially.
Madeline, do you want to just touch on, I saw Jay put in the chat, educational facilities. I know we talked about parks quite a bit, but then didn't necessarily include that in these kind of core four. Do you want to touch on that?
Certainly, Steve, thanks for bringing that up. And Jay, thanks for raising the question. We're guided in terms of what are defined as facilities by Division 11, OIR 66011-0005. And also, again, in some of our middle housing work in Division 4. I'm certain that some of the reference to those four types of facilities were in the context of production of housing. And internally, we discussed whether parks and likely also educational facilities might be considered necessary to the production of housing. And our conclusion was that though these are critical amenities to the community, they do not create opportunity or prevent necessarily housing from being produced. They may affect the quality of that housing and or the locational factor of needed housing, as you'll sort of foreshadowing a conversation we'll have with our colleagues at the Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee. But in fact, they may not, the absence of a park does not preclude the development of housing.
Thanks, Madeline. That's really helpful. Damien.
Thanks, Steve. I wanted to second the comments about electrical supply, power supply from Heather. We've had similar experiences in Bend dealing with Pacific Power. I don't know to what extent these are long-term and systemic issues, though, or just more short-term. They're trying to get caught up with some of the growth we've seen. So that's just, food for thought. I did want to make a comment about stormwater, though, and just recognize as we're looking at stormwater that the needs for jurisdictions here on what I'll call the drier side will look different than those in the valley or on the coast in terms of our ability to contain stormwater in dry wells through on-site landscaping treatments. And so consider that as part of the overall framework for looking at public facilities, or at least how these services are provided.
Thank you, Damien. Brock.
So just based on the public facilities that require a plan for them, sewer, water, transportation, instead of sewer, I'm seeing wastewater. Is there a reason why we're using a potentially broader term there? Just wondering what the differentiation was, the reasoning behind it.
I don't know that there is a differentiation intended. Madeline?
Brock, I would echo Steve's response. My understanding is that most jurisdictions do a wastewater facilities master plan.
Yeah, okay.
And that's the regulatory form that DEQ accepts. I think sewer might be a more colloquial way of describing it. In fact, sewer, I think, is a bit more broad than wastewater in some contexts, because there's a storm sewer and there's a regular sewer, for lack of better definition. But in fact, they're meant to be one and the same.
Okay, that makes sense. Just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something. Thank you.
Any other comments or observations on this topic of public facility type? I just appreciate everyone. The last two questions, like, we didn't spend that much time on them, but you raised like what seemed like all the pertinent topics. So we appreciate that. But I want to make sure we've covered everything, and before we move on to what is next and what is really the kind of primary topic we had for today's meeting. Al, go ahead.
Just one real quick one. Water is provided sometimes by special district, but also by private water companies. I don't know about the others ever being private, but public facilities, even if they're provided by a private water company, I assume would be considered a public facility, right?
Yes, Al, in the context of whoever the jurisdiction is that regulates the development of a housing unit will require the ability to serve from either a contract district that's a private or public utility. So in this context, I would answer your question yes. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Al. Did you have anything
I'm done.
else? Go ahead.
No.
Okay. Okay, well then let's go ahead and move on to our next slide. So the meat of the conversation for today is really, how do we know when an area is readily served, and what might the role, and we'll down the road be talking more about housing production strategies, but for today we kind of focused on what role do capital improvement plans play and how we think about land that is readily served with public facilities. And then just keeping in mind, back to Madeline's introduction for us at the beginning of the meeting, how can cities prevent or mitigate displacement due to public infrastructure investments, a lens that we should be thinking about as we have this conversation. And I think there's a next slide that talks about readily served. Is that correct? Yeah. Madeline, maybe you want to cover this piece.
Sure, Steve. Readily served is has some ambiguity, and I want to speak to that a little bit more specifically because of the operative words available or can. Either for planned urban development is available or can be either provided or made subject to committed financing. This brings a level of interpretation to the way that served is used. So readily served, let me give an example for those of us who are more example-based. A property can be served by a utility that is within 300 feet of a property line. It can also be served by a facility that is within a much longer distance, say 2,000 feet of a property line. Both are serviceable, but one is feasible and the other might not be. And the question at hand is, and I want to, before we dive into the definition of serviceable, I want to maybe flip back to the previous slide for a moment, Karin, if you will, and emphasize the word readily. And readily might help us describe a timing question. And Mary Kyle, thank you for bringing that up at the top of our conversation. Readily is a term that in this context, we understand to mean the timeline on which a city produces a housing production strategy. So 6 years in the metro area, 8 years in other areas of the state. On top of this, we have a little bit more to unpack, and that is the role that a capital improvements plan plays in the understanding of committed financing. So we can actually flip back to or go to the next slide now, Karin. Committed financing to provide sewer, water, and transportation capacity for urban development. My experience, which might be limited, is that capital improvement planning is often changes year to year. Every 5 years, a city does traditionally a city does a capital improvement plan, agrees to a set of projects that are eligible for funding and or work plan scheduling in a particular fiscal cycle. Those projects change wildly throughout the timeline of that CIP document. Typically, it's something that comes to a budget committee in most cities, and annually it changes because construction has its vagaries, funding has vagaries, outside funding sometimes changes the prioritization of those projects, the availability and opportunity for outside funding. And so the words readily available and committed financing are two things that I'd very much like to open up for conversation and discussion this time.
Perfect. Thanks, Madeline. Kasara.
Yeah, maybe this has to do with the outside financing, but reading through this, the question that popped into mind is when we talk about, serviceable and financing, does that assume it's by a public agency? Because we have the capital improvement plans. but we oftentimes end up with a, developer who may be ready to go and is willing to actually put in public lines for us. And then they can maybe be eligible for credits or reimbursement for putting in that infrastructure. So maybe introducing even more complexity that we often have private developers installing public infrastructure as well.
Thanks, Kasara. Karen.
Sorry, my mouse battery seems to have died, so I had to drag my finger around. So I'm actually going to speak with my transportation hat on. Transportation is a very big word, and so maybe that's defined more. But I think that it is something we need to think about because transportation could mean sidewalks. Transportation could mean bike lanes. Transportation could be how an intersection functions for automobiles. Transportation could be transit. And it's not, I wasn't clear. So we initially talked about types of infrastructure. And transportation is a type, but we really haven't been able to talk about the details within that type, right? So I think there's just a lot there. And this is something that's come up for us kind of in previous work where some of our residents are like, there are no sidewalks here. So therefore it doesn't have the services, right? It doesn't have a place to walk. So I'm kind of concerned about that. And again, I don't know if that's worked out through the rules or whatnot. So, and I also agree that it becomes less clear with regards to capital improvement plans, that what makes then on the transportation capacity side, something then that's serviceable, within the window that we need. Because my point is there's a lot of interpretation there in relationships to the different modes.
Thank you so much, Karen. That's really helpful. Al, go ahead.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, the words readily, adequate, and likely are three that I think we probably have to deal with in this. The term adequate, normally it's unusual to see it show up in a housing statute as opposed to somewhere else. Over the years, adequate has been a term that the courts have said is clearly not clear and objective. And in my representing various groups, affordable housing, non-affordable housing, whatever, adequacy of various kinds of services, whether it's school or fire or sewer or water, is often the main litigated issue. And the way we normally dealt with that was to say, and local jurisdictions have agreed, and Blue has agreed, that term adequate is not a clear and objective standard. So I think there needs to be interpretive rulemaking that goes to resolve that issue. I think it can be done by interpretation that defines what adequate means in specific circumstances, and it requires that it be defined in a way, either locally, in public facilities plan or otherwise, so that it doesn't become a basis for litigation. So that's one key thing. The same can be said with readily. And then we can tie it all back to the basic requirement of the housing capacity statutes, which is that these things have to be shown to be likely to be done. And that is a probability. And that requires that there be that a local jurisdiction find that the ponderance of the evidence, that's more likely than not, that what we say is going to happen will in fact be able to happen. Not necessarily that will happen, but will be able to happen during that time. So I think that these are issues that need to be addressed through rulemaking, and it has to be really, really careful. And it certainly shouldn't be broadened out unduly, because park capacity and school capacity and emergency response capacity are very, very uncertain, flexible terms. As I think Karen pointed out, transportation is never adequate. Fire protection is never adequate. Most of these things are never adequate in most people's minds. And certainly, if I'm a school superintendent, I'm not going to say that I have adequate funding for my schools. I've been through that. So it's just one of those things where you need to be careful to not undermine the basic goal that we're all looking for here, that this really works. Now, a brief comment on the equity issue. I think Damien was saying that it does happen, or someone was saying that it does happen that a lot of jurisdictions end up putting in a fair amount of their infrastructure with the help of developers who can afford, because of what they're planning to build, provide that infrastructure. Certainly that's the case with Brooks Resources in Bend, which Damien's familiar with. They do a huge amount of infrastructure over there. It happens elsewhere. It's a great thing, but it doesn't pencil for a lot of places that I think would be covered by the equity lens issue of displacement. So you don't get the services to those places. I do know one jurisdiction on the South Coast which has committed to extend services to an area inside the UGB if what's built there is restricted for affordable development. So there are ways of having of tying together the provision of infrastructure and affordability. So that's a possible approach. Thanks.
Thank you, Al. It seems like there is some some consensus that these definitions are vague at this point. So I'm hoping that as we continue the conversation, folks can contribute some thoughts and ideas about how we might begin to more precisely define what we mean by adequate or what we mean by readily. Just a comment there. Go ahead, Brock.
I'll touch a couple points. One, I think adequate could either be defined in rule, or that could be something that local governments are directed to define. What does adequate mean for our community? Just an option there. But the two kind of more substantive points. One, looking at the definition of development ready lands, right, likely to support the production of housing during the period of their housing production target for the HPS, as Mary Kyle and Al had talked about. So I think anything that, as far as timelines, readily served, I think you would want to look at, okay, here's our housing production strategy. Here's how long it takes to go through the process to actually, break ground on construction, right? Take that time that it takes to break ground back from either your 6 or 8 year period. And if you can, let's say it takes 2 years on average or whatever. So if you have a 6 year period, then 4 years, if you can adequately serve it within 4 years, then that's readily served. Unless, the infrastructure is already there and you can just break ground as soon as your permit's approved. And then as far as, and I know this kind of touches on B, which is, provision of public facility or near-term provision of public facilities through an adopted capital improvement plan. So if you don't have a capital improvement plan that says, hey, we have money ready and allocated to go to this, then I don't think it's development ready land, and you can adopt it and make it development ready land in a subsequent capital improvement plan. But if it's not already funding approved to help do this, I don't think that fits the definition based on my interpretation of reading the statute.
Thanks, Brock. Let's getting into more of the details. Let's go to Derek and then we'll get back to you, Damien.
Thanks. I would just mention a few things. One, with respect to CIP, I think we want to be pretty flexible in what that can be. There are a lot of jurisdictions, including Newport, where we don't have a formal CIP. We use our budget for that purpose. And so I think we just want to keep that in mind. Another thing, hopefully it doesn't get lost as we talk about serviceability, but again, drainage or stormwater now falls off. Now it's just sewer water and transportation capacity. But I think, as we all know, any transportation with impervious surfaces is invariably tied at the hip with stormwater. So hopefully that doesn't get lost through the discussion. And then also when we talk about committed financing can be in place, I think we want to be clear. What are we talking about? Fully funding, or are we talking about committed for design within that window? You know, oftentimes we underfund capital projects in our budget because, you know, we're just tackling the design phase, not the full construction. And in fact, we need to get through that design phase to really kind of fully inform our understanding of what the scope of the project is and the needed funding is. So that's all I wanted to share.
No, that's great. I appreciate that. Damien, go ahead.
Thanks, Steve. I'm kind of building on what Brock and Derek have already shared regarding the capital improvement plan. And what I'd recommend is distinguishing between the capital improvement plan that will be adopted as part of a Goal 11 public facility plan that has projects identified in the short term, medium, and long term, versus a city that actually has a 5-year capital improvement program where they adopt that as part of their annual budget. Because I think that would be more, or potentially more relevant to looking at whether something is serviceable and development ready. If, for example, somebody can look to a project and say, this improvement that's needed for my project is going to be done in year 3. So I should be development ready, or this land should be considered development ready. And so this also goes back to definitions in terms of distinguishing between a public facility plan's capital improvement plan over a 20-year period versus whether a city has adopted a 5-year CIP, 5-year capital improvement program.
I appreciate that timeline distinction that you just highlighted, and it speaks to a phenomenon in many facilities and master plans related to constrained project lists. To summarize, projects on a fiscally constrained project list are those that will be completed within the planning horizon of that particular plan. So a transportation facility is funded or fundable within the projected revenue of that fund in the timeline of that planning document. That isn't as applicable or doesn't have as much applicability in the context of a public facilities plan, which simply shows the ability of a community to serve an area, which would meet Goal 11. And I would emphasize and agree that this language speaks to something that is closer or more akin to a capital improvement program, something that is adopted with a much shorter time horizon.
Thanks, Madeline. Heather, go ahead.
I'm thinking ahead to what it would take to demonstrate this, because as others have already talked about, when we do our UGB analysis, we have to update the PFP to include long-term and short-term projects. And then there's a subset of that that ends up being adopted into a CIP when those projects get more refined. The companion to housing, we have to show, I think we still have to show, unless this got removed, for employment land, you have to show that you have a short-term employment land supply, which I apologize, I was out until today, so I didn't have time to look back at that requirement, but I wonder if I'm just thinking about not wanting to have to do 3 different types of utility analysis. And so I do wonder if there's some synergy that or lining up that could happen between what I think in both cases the goal is, what is your short-term land supply and for housing and employment, and how can you demonstrate that? So like I say, I apologize, I was out for the last couple of days, so I couldn't really look that up, but I do wonder if there's anything there that would be helpful in definition or if rulemaking needs to be highlighted that part of the statute also needs to be looked at, or that part of the rules. just to get that synergy. So anyway, just a comment.
Thanks, Beth. You have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just pulled up the statute for that, the administrative rule. In goal 9, short-term supply of land means land that is suitable land that is ready for construction within 1 year of an application for a building permit or request of service extension. Engineering feasibility is sufficient to qualify land for the short-term supply of land. Funding availability is not required. And so that's, I think, pretty different than what we've been talking about here.
Yeah.
And we find is if you don't have to care about funding and you assume that, you know, there's enough money to do it, just about anything could be done in a year. And that's not that's a standard that's less than helpful.
Got it. Yeah, thank you for looking that up. And definitely a broken record on saying that funding is our big issue with infrastructure. So yeah, that will be a challenge. Okay, never mind.
No, that's still, I think what you say about not, trying to reduce the workload for cities, multiple requirements, asking for similar information is important. Sorry, Madeline, go ahead.
Just a quick rejoinder, Heather, to the comment you did make, though, and I wanted to highlight it for this group, and I did not share this ahead in this presentation, but goal 11 does speak to, for those unfamiliar, does speak to two qualifier lists of projects, so short-term and long-term projects, and perhaps, Heather, without making the reference to employment land necessarily, there could be opportunity to refine what short-term refers to in this context related to housing and or residentially zoned developable land. And perhaps that ties together some of the discussion points that we're bringing up here, ready serviceability and the timeline on which we're working.
Karen, go ahead.
Okay, so this may be a very basic question, but it will help me understand. So when we're talking about these development-ready lands, this is the subset of land that we will then be able to show how we're accommodating the housing target. Is that accurate? So we have buildable lands and we do a buildable lands analysis and we do our housing capacity analysis and then we get strategies, housing production strategies. But then we take a subset of that land that we think is development ready in the next 6 to 8 years, depending on what our requirement is. And so that's really what we're talking about here is kind of what is that subset that we can consider when we show accommodation of our housing target. Is that?
That's you hit the nail on the head there, Karen. This is exactly a analysis of a subset of the partially vacant and vacant land. And just to foreshadow, the question is a city able to accommodate the target needed housing in the timeline related to typical of an HPS? And so there's only the one nuance I would add is that those strategies can be determined after a development ready land analysis is completed. There are some that are not geographically specific and are not planning specific, and those might be finance or incentive related, for example, strategies. This perhaps pertains specifically to the capacity of the land that you've identified as partially vacant and vacant. There are many instances, just to give an example or a follow-on, that land is partially vacant or vacant and is perhaps identified by a community to be available for increased utilization. So an increase in the land use intensity, for example, that might be zoned that way, but is not serviced. And these are not development ready lands. once they are in, so you take a parcel that's low density residential and you say, we'd love to do some efficiency measure work to upzone this property. A city is only required to go to the extent of saying it can be served by to achieve a higher density in order to be rezoned, but it in fact is not development ready for that increased zoned capacity. So we run into some challenges in sequencing that work to be able to satiate a target of need.
Well, I think I have a lot to learn, so thank you for that description.
I think we all do, Karen. Go ahead, Al.
Yeah, this is a question for clarification, and I think it's something I should know the answer to, but when we're looking at this subset, is this subset purely quantitative, or does it somehow have to relate to the housing needs analysis? So for example, if you can show you have enough development ready land, but it's all in one part of town or all at one price level or one housing type, have you met the requirement, or is that something that gets folded in at another stage?
Great question, Al. This for everyone's clarification, this is the question relates to the shift in work to housing capacity analyses as they've been reinterpreted through the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. So in fact, if a community has a target allocation that they receive from the Department of Administrative Services as determined through this Oregon Housing Needs Analysis process, and they only have land in one part of town that only meets one income level, it's very unlikely that they are meeting their target, because those targets will be delivered to communities not only in quantity, but in cohort brackets of income level. So unless that one area of town is zoned with the potential to meet all of those different income levels, there's a very low likelihood that they are meeting their target with that one area.
Steve, I lost my raise my hand function.
Oh, well, your real
I don't know
hand
where-
works just fine.
Yes, I was going to add, and Al, it's right in line with where you're going. I think, what we're discovering, to Karen's point, out in Clackamas County, or whether it's a large city like Portland that has aging water pipes, or a small city out in Eastern Umatilla, or Joseph, or folks out there, having zoned capacity has been one thing, whether it's developed, partially developed, redevelopable, and we kind of got into that. And then finding 100-year-old clay pipes or even wooden pipes and realizing that zoned capacity and the cost to realize that is where this challenge comes for many cities, that this phantom paper capacity versus readily. And now we have this quantified time frame within 8 years, or I guess in the metro region, 6 years. And so it becomes a bit more of a complex analysis. And for me, it's been very educational listening to you all of, towns that use their budget and their as a CIP and vice versa, and how that fits into their public facilities planning. And then what is that role with our land use planning and our comprehensive plans? Where does that fit in? So to Maddie's point, a city has only been asked to demonstrate that they have the residential capacity, the zoned capacity, and really planning for density. But we haven't really planned for infrastructure capacity to realize that zone density.
Thank you, Conan. Other thoughts on, I think where our focus here is, what we mean by readily served. We've talked a lot about timeline and about funding, readiness or finance readiness. Are there other characteristics? I think Madeline mentioned at the beginning, and maybe eventually this all just goes back to cost, but location of existing infrastructure relative to the areas we want to serve. I don't know what other factors should we be considering as we're trying to define or thinking about how readily served might be defined? I don't want to put anyone on the spot necessarily. Anyone from the DLCD team or Beth have any considerations that we should be thinking about here?
Steve, I would just bring back to the top front of mind for folks this afternoon, the characteristic of proportionality of utility planning to zoned capacity, and highlight that many cities do great work when it comes to planning for facilities, especially related to the practical application of utilities. What is harder to determine is the proportionality of how that will be implemented, because of the unknown factors of who will develop and what will be built in a place that has a zoned capacity of 12 to 24 units. It's nearly impossible to guess what that is ahead of time. But what is known or true is that we know that there are often large facilities that are required. Pump stations come to mind, large trunk sewer and water lines that cities may not have great strategies for how they will be implemented. That's not always a component of utility planning for those facility master plans. And I maybe would wonder if folks have had experience or can relate to those challenges that might inform some of the ways we approach this question.
Go ahead, Brock.
Actually, I'm just going to keep my hand up as a hold. I have a different comment, but I'll let anyone that just wants to respond to Madeline's point do that first if they have any.
Does anyone have any thoughts on that question about proportionality that Madeline raised? Go ahead, Brock. I think it can just inform our thinking as we move towards wrapping up our conversation.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned this earlier. Just a quick jump back to that development ready lands part C. I think we also need to consider, as far as encumbrances, whether the infrastructure can be done there. For example, with the new NFIP FEMA program that's coming out, right? If we're talking about, the ability to add infrastructure, specifically subsurface infrastructure in an area, can that infrastructure even realistically go in? For example, if you have to put a sewer line in or a water line, if it's above ground, right, you're not going to run into the kind of grading and filling conditions that are applicable there. And of course, we haven't seen the full thing yet, but just a note to make sure we're considering stuff like that.
Thank you. And if we don't have any comments on our primary question, I'll just revisit our racial equity framework question about how cities can prevent or mitigate displacement that might be due to or influenced by our infrastructure investments. Any thoughts or comments on that topic before we move into our next steps? Go ahead, Al.
Thanks. Just a thought about the equity lens and goal 10. Goal 10 is got a sort of a double focus. It's dealing with past inequities that have tended to concentrate certain communities in areas of deprivation and exposure. But it's also denied access to other areas of opportunity throughout a jurisdiction. Most of us on this call live in those areas of opportunity. And I think that an equity lens that complies with the spirit and the word letter of Goal 10 is one that would also ask the question, how can cities encourage access through public infrastructure investments to areas of opportunity that have a history of exclusion.
Thanks, Al. I'll note quick that because Sarah mentioned in the chat, that in addition to proximity, which could be a useful measure, we also need to be thinking about topography, drainage basins, creek crossings, and many other factors that go beyond just proximity. Karen, go ahead.
So I think about in the question how jurisdictions can prevent or mitigate displacement due to public infrastructure investments. And I think about the importance of when the planning of both the primary infrastructure, or maybe I'd say the spine of the infrastructure, the very large investments is being done, is that there should be engagement and participation and the whole suite of thought about infusing equity within those decision-making processes. I mean, think about that. We're working on a project right now that has to do with a large roadway infrastructure investment. And as a part of that project, we're thinking about anti-displacement strategies. Okay, so it's part of it's done at the time that the project is happening, and that's when that's thought about. I think another example of how jurisdictions could prevent displacement is being able to fund programs that encourage people to continue to live in their homes. And we've done that in Clackamas County in the in our North Clackamas revitalization area, where we have funding that provides access to, homeowners can have access to sewer, or funds to be able to extend sewer lines, or different things. There are different things for home improvement. And so there's different ways for jurisdictions there's different actions that they would take. But I'm not quite sure how we fold those actions specifically into this work we're doing here.
Thanks, Karen. I think today it's the ideas that are important, and we'll keep working on the details as we move forward. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think Al mentioned this earlier on in the context of equity in terms of developers contributing to getting the infrastructure in place to support a particular development and just rolling those costs into whatever product they're looking to build, and how that then prices out people for new housing. But I think we want to also keep in mind, and this is why this topic is so challenging. I mean, from our perspective, affordable housing always has to be subsidized. There's really no way for us to get it on the ground in any other way. But if you lean too heavily on your existing tax base, you generate equity issues too, and you drive people out. For example, I mean, water and wastewater. I mean, those improvements are commonly funded with either a general obligation bond. If we're talking about a new wastewater or expansion of a wastewater treatment plant, or revenue bonds, and those revenue bonds, or the general obligation bonds, that those tie back to taxpayers. Either the taxes they pay on their property or the utility rates they pay. And in Newport, we have a pretty significant number of folks with fixed incomes, and they can't afford significant water or wastewater rate hikes. And that would drive them, to a point where they'd have to look at other housing options. So I think we need to look at equity in a fairly broad sense. It is a challenging one.
Thanks, Derek. I think that's a good note for us to end on for today. Let's go to our next step slide. I think Karen's gonna lead us through this one.
Yeah, I thought I would wrap up with some of the highlights that we'll think through as we start to enter into what do capacity rules around capacity for Division 8 look like, and really thinking about both the land inventory, what we've been talking about, constraints within the land inventory, those ambiguities around partially developable or partially vacant, redevelopable, and then estimating your capacity, or really trying to quantify that, and then really forecasting the redevelopment. And when we think about infrastructure and the public facilities plans or the CIP plans, it's been interesting to hear the different actions that are happening at the local level, whether that's a separate annexation into a service district or a city, or if that's happening simultaneously or sequentially, and how that happens. There's a lot of ambiguity here around what is partially encumbered. What does it mean to be encumbered entirely, completely, or partially? And what does that mean for development? And then hearing about our public infrastructure or our water services, non-potable water and reuse. Casera hadn't even crossed my mind until you brought that up, building out infrastructure for that. So it's been really helpful. And then I think as we think about public facilities planning in the context of both our land inventory and what's readily available in this time period, and then how that public facilities plans play into larger land use planning, I think we're going to extend this conversation a bit more in depth next month in July with that first meeting. And then we wanted to circle back to some of the pieces of forecasting redevelopment. There were talks about mixed use zones and how to really think about, what's the precedence for residential development in there and how do you estimate that? Thinking about some of those CCNR questions that came up. And then we're hoping at the end of July to bring in folks from the Needs and Production Advisory Committee. So they're really looking at, once you have these production targets, once you have your housing need allocated, then how do you translate that? What types of housing do you need? What's the housing mix that you're planning for? What are some of the characteristics of that housing that your community needs? And then locational factors. Where do you need this type of housing? And integrating throughout all of that, affirmatively furthering fair housing. So where do you know in your community you have housing disparities, and what does that look like? And what does that mean when you inventory? Here's what I know about my buildable land over the 20-year horizon. What do I know? How do I know more about my readily developable land within that 6 or 8 year period? And how do I meet the housing need within that 6 or 8 period? Or how do I move towards progress to meeting that identified housing need? And if we have infrastructure constraints, if that is a constraint, what does that look like for policy and strategies in my community for decision makers? I think there's some really good examples here in this group, and that's why we've convened all of you together. But there's really great examples here about cities making really tough decisions about how to fund infrastructure as a constraint. And as Derek said, that falls on the ratepayers, it falls on the taxpayers, and we must remember that renters are ratepayers and taxpayers. They just pay it to a landlord, but they too are paying into the same taxes that the rest of your community is. So all that to say, I gained a lot out of it. I hope the highlights that I've lifted up are valid and accurate, and you two all are learning from each other. And in July, we'll continue this conversation. We'll add in what we're learning from Needs and Production around needed housing. And then in August, we hope to conclude with, here's what the rules really need to consider as staff think about towards the end of the year. What does it look like writing some draft rules for this? And at least we can, with this group, say, here's the guidance we've gotten from you as we use the fall months and maybe the latter part of this year to start putting pen to paper and what might these rules look like. So that we'll look forward to that in August. And then we have a lot of work ahead of us around urbanization. So don't forget infrastructure and public facilities throughout concept planning, throughout UGB amendments and proposals. But I will conclude with that as far as my key takeaways here today and looking ahead. Steve, did I miss any? I always miss something. Steve, tell me what I missed.
No, that was wonderful. So our next meeting, as shown on the slide, is July 11th. But then, can we confirm that our the second meeting in July is the following Thursday on the 18th? Yeah. So please be mentally aware that there's going to be a quick succession of meetings following your 4th of July holiday. I hope everyone gets a chance to enjoy that. As always, there'll be a follow-up meeting with the Miro board link for thoughts that you weren't able to get out today, or things that occur to you as you think about these topics a little bit more. And I think that covers us, right, Karen?
That's exactly what I forgot. In my
There-
notes, it says Happy 4th of July.
There you go.
We will meet on the 11th and the 18th due to that.
Yeah. Thanks, Madeline, for your presentation and commentary today. Thank you all. Enjoy, hopefully, a relaxing holiday in a couple of weeks, and we will see you on July 11th.